Hello, students. This is chapter 7. Our topic is consumers, producers, and the efficiency of markets. Our goal is to answer the following questions. What is consumer surplus? How does it relate to the demand curve? What is producer surplus? How is it related to the supply curve? Do markets produce a desirable allocation of resources, or could the market outcome be improved? So let's start by defining welfare economics. Regarding the allocation of resources, and that refers to how much of each good is produced, which producers produce it, which consumers consume it. So, welfare economics studies how the allocation of resources affect economic well-being. Let's look at the willingness to pay, or WTP. A buyer's willingness to pay for a good is the maximum amount the buyer will pay for that good. How much the buyer values the good is reflected in what and how badly the guy wants the good. So here is a schedule, and Anthony is willing to pay $250 for an iPod, Chad 175, Flea 300, and John 125. That is their willingness to pay. Question: if price of iPod is $200, who will buy an iPod? And what is quantity demanded? Okay. Number A, Anthony and Flea will buy an iPod. Chad and John will not. So how many will be demanded? 2 units of iPod will be demanded when the price is 200. Because Anthony's willingness to pay is 250, that is higher than the price of iPod, and Flea's willingness to pay is 300. So these two guys will buy iPod that is costing $200. So let us drive the demand curve for this market for iPod. These are the price ranges, and we're going to figure out who buys it and how many units of iPod. When the price of iPod is $300 and one and above, nobody buys it because everybody's willingness to pay is below $301. When the price is between 250 and 300, Flea will buy because Flea's willingness to pay is 300. So Flea will be buying iPod. When the price is between 176 to $250, Anthony and Flea will be in the market. Anthony's willingness to pay is 250. Flea's willingness to pay is 300. So these two gentlemen will buy an iPod. When the price goes down, Chad, Anthony, and Flea. Now the price goes between 126 to 175, and you'll find that Chad now enters the market because Chad's willingness to pay is 175, and the price has declined sufficient to get Chad in the market. If the price goes between 0 and 125, even John will join the market because John's willingness to pay is 125. So all the 4 gentlemen will buy an iPod, and 4 iPods will be sold in this market. So when we plot this demand schedule on a graph, it would be like a step. So you can see the first step, one iPod will be demanded, and when the price goes down, the second iPod will be demanded. Between 176 to 250, 2 iPods will be sold. When the price goes down to 170, let's see, yeah, 126 to 175, three iPods will be purchased. And when the price goes down between 126 and 175, we will see that the fourth iPod will be purchased when the price goes down further. Okay, so this is a typical demand curve, but this demand curve looks like a staircase with four steps, one per buyer. If there were a huge number of buyers, as in a competitive market, there would be a huge number of very tiny steps, and it would look more like a smooth curve. So the demand curve that you probably are used to seeing is a smooth straight line. Picture in your mind that those are millions and millions of demand curves. Each of them, if you put a microscope to them, will look like a stairways or a staircase. Okay. At any output, the height of the demand curve is the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer. The marginal buyer is the buyer who would leave the market if price were any higher. For example, at $300, flea is the marginal buyer. If price goes to 301, flea will be out of the market, and that makes flea a marginal buyer at this level. Consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the difference between the willingness to pay and the price. Amount a buyer is willing to pay minus the amount the buyer actually pays. Suppose price is 260. Flea's consumer surplus is 300 minus 260, which is 40. In other words, Flea's willingness to pay is 300, but he gets to pay 260. So there is a $40 consumer surplus. The others get no consumer surplus because they do not buy an iPod at this price. So total consumer surplus, if Flea is the only individual purchasing iPod, is $40. Okay, that is Flea's consumer surplus. So total surplus at that point is $40. Now, suppose the price goes down to 220. Okay, Flea's consumer surplus will increase because it will be 300, which is Flea's willingness to pay, and 220, which is now the price that at which iPod is being sold. So the difference is $80. So when the price has gone down, Flea's consumer surplus has gone up. But Anthony now joins the market also. So Anthony's consumer surplus will be 250 minus 220. You remember Anthony's willingness to pay was 250 and the price of an iPod is 220. So for Anthony, consumer surplus is $30. So total surplus at this point is the $80, which is consumer surplus for Flea, and $30 Anthony's consumer surplus. You add the two, that is 110, which is the green area in this diagram. Total consumer surplus equals area under the demand curve above the price from 0 to the output being sold. So let's look at consumer surplus with lots of buyers and a smooth demand curve. The price is measured on the vertical axis and output being sold is measured on the horizontal axis. And that negatively sloped curve is the demand curve. And I'm sure that is the demand curve that you're used to seeing. This is the market for shoes. At output 5,000, the marginal buyer is willing to pay $50. You go right up to the demand curve and drop the perpendicular on the vertical axis. That is the marginal buyer willing to pay. That is the willingness to pay for a pair of shoes. Suppose the price declines to 30, okay? Then his consumer surplus is 20. So the marginal buyer's willingness to pay is 50 and the price goes to 30, then the consumer surplus is $20. Consumer surplus is the area between price, $30, and the demand curve, the area under the demand curve. It is this blue triangle from 0 to 15. Recall the area of a triangle equals 1/2 times base times height. So how do we calculate the consumer surplus? The consumer surplus is the area of this blue triangle. The height of this triangle is from 30 to 60, that is 30. And the base of this triangle is from 0 to 15, which is 15. So consumer surplus is 1/2 times 15 times 30, which is 225. So the consumer surplus is 225, the area of the green triangle. If price rises to $40, consumer surplus will decline to, in this case, 100, because the new consumer surplus is this pink, I think that's pink, that pink triangle. Price has gone up to 30. The height of this triangle is now 20, that is 40 minus 60. The base of this triangle is 10. 1/2 times 10 times 20 is 100. And as you can see, when the price goes up, consumer surplus declines. Two reasons for the fall in consumer surplus. One reason is fall in consumer surplus due to buyers leaving the market. The marginal buyer will leave the market. Price has gone above my willingness to pay. I'm out of this market. So the area of this little triangle here is people leaving the market from 15 down to 10 because they no longer want to pay that price. The other decline, the other fall in consumer surplus is due to remaining buyers paying higher price. Okay, so the price was 30, now it is 40. Those who are going to pay it anyway are now paying a higher price, and that reduces their consumer surplus. A learning exercise. Number A, find the marginal buyer's willingness to pay at 10 units of output. Number B, find consumer surplus consumer surplus when price is $30. And number C, suppose price falls to 20, how much consumer surplus will increase due to number C, buyers entering the market, number D, existing buyers paying lower price. So let's look at the answers. Number one, at 10 units of output, the marginal buyer's willingness to pay is 30. And so the consumer surplus is this blue triangle. The area of that triangle is 1/2 times 10 times 10, and that is 50. If the price falls to 20, from 30 to 20, consumer surplus for the additional buyers will be 1/2 times 10 times 10, which is going to be 50. That's number C. Number D, increase in consumer surplus on initial 10 units is equal to 10 times 10, which is equal to 100. Let's talk about producer surplus. Producer surplus is the value of everything a seller must give up to produce a good. That is the definition of cost. The cost is the value of everything a seller must give up to produce a good. It measures the willingness to sell, produce, and sell the goods or service only if the price is greater than the cost. For example, the cost of 3 sellers in the lawn cutting business. Jack would be willing to cut a lawn at $10. Janet would be willing to cut this lawn for $20. Chrissy would be willing to cut this lawn for $35. They've got willingness to sell at different prices. So let us use this data to derive the supply schedule from the cost data. When the price is 0 to 9, nobody's willing to cut a lawn for that much. So nobody's going to agree to that price. But when the price is increased to between 10 and 9, Jack will take that off and say, okay, I'll cut your lawn for $10. Because you have met Jack's willingness to sell his services at that price. When the price is increased to 20 to 34, Janet will join the market. Janet will say, okay, I will also cut your lawn. So 2 services will be offered. When the price goes to 35, even Chrissy would get into the bidding war. So let us plot that information, all right? You will see that when the price offered is between 0 and 9, nobody's going to offer to cut your lawn. Okay, you have to raise the price. You go higher than that. When you go to 10, between 10 and 19, one person will accept to take that offer. When you raise it to 20 to 34, two people will take that offer. And when it goes to 35 and up, all 3 people will be out there mowing your lawn. So at each output, Q is output, the height of the supply curve is the cost of the marginal seller. The marginal seller is the seller who would leave the market if the price were any lower. Okay. So here, Jack's cost was $10. Anything lower than that, Jack is out of this market. So at that point, Jack is the marginal seller. Janet is a marginal seller at $20. You offer $19, Janet is not accepting it. So Janet is a marginal seller at $20. And Chrissy is a marginal seller at a higher price, that I think it was 35. So producer surplus is defined as the difference between the price and the cost. The amount a seller is paid for a good minus the seller's cost of producing it. That is the seller's willingness to sell. The price received minus willingness to sell. So, producer surplus, price minus cost. Suppose the price is $25. Jack's producer surplus is 15 because Janet's producer surplus is $5 and Chris's producer surplus is 0. Chris is not going to accept to take this contract. So total producer surplus would be 20, which is 15 for Jack plus 5 for Janet. Total producer surplus equals the area of the supply curve under the price, this blue area here, and above the supply curve. That is producer surplus. And let us plot it on a smooth curve Again, price is measured on the vertical axis and output measured on the horizontal axis. If the price is 40, okay, if the price offered is 40, at 15, at output 15,000, the marginal seller's cost is 30 and her producer surplus is 10. In other words, is willing to accept 30, but the market is offering 40, so the producer surplus is the difference, $10. Producer surplus is the area between the price, in this case $40, and the supply curve. Okay, it's above the supply curve and below the price, the area of this triangle. The height of the triangle is, I think, 25, and the base of the triangle is 25. So the area of this triangle is 1/2 times base times height. If price falls to 30, if the price goes from 40 to 30, you clearly will see that producer surplus will decline. Okay, the new producer surplus is now the yellow triangle, which is 1/2 times base times height. That is 1/2 times 15 times 15, and that is $112.50. Two reasons for the fall in producer surplus. Okay, the fall in producer surplus due to sellers leaving the market. Somebody says, "No, I am not selling the product at that particular price. I'm getting out of the market," and that is measured by the area of that smaller triangle. But then there are also those who will stay in the market but now accept the lower price. So number 2 here, fall in producer surplus due to remaining sellers getting lower price. Let's look at a learning exercise. Number A, find the marginal seller's cost at Q equal to 10. And number B, find the total producer surplus for P equals to 20. Then suppose price rises to 30, find the increase in producer surplus due to number C, selling 5 additional units, number D, getting a higher price on the initial 10 units. Let's look at the answers. At 10, the marginal seller price is 20. Number B, the producer surplus is the area of this triangle. And the area of this triangle is 1/2 times 10 times 20, which is 100. Now, let's look at number C. Price rises to 30. Price goes to 30. There's going to be an increase in the producer surplus due to people joining the market. Okay, price goes to 30, producer surplus on additional units is the area of that small triangle. Those are new people joining the market because the price is higher. Increase in producer surplus on initial 10 units. Those who are already in the market but are now enjoying higher price is the area of this rectangle here, which in this case is 100. The area of this rectangle is 100. Let's talk about market efficiency. Total surplus is a reflection of market efficiency, and it is consumer surplus, producer surplus. The sum of those two is the total surplus. Consumer surplus is equal to the value to buyers, which is the amount minus the amount paid by the buyers. Sorry, consumer surplus is equal to the value to buyers or the buyer's willingness to pay minus the amount they actually pay. Buyers gain from participating in the marketplace is the consumer surplus. Producer surplus is the amount received by the sellers minus the cost to the sellers. And it is the sellers' gain from participating in the market. So total surplus is the value to buyers minus cost to sellers. Let's talk about markets allocation of resources. Allocation of resources is a desirable goal if it is efficient. Okay? Our economy is decentralized. Okay? That is a market economy. It's determined by interactions of many self-interested buyers and sellers. There's no central authority here. So total surplus measure of society's well-being. Total surplus measure of society's well-being. To consider whether the market's allocation is efficient, let's look at efficient allocation of resources. It should maximize total surplus. So, number one, the goods are consumed by the buyers who value them most. If you want to know that the market is working efficiently, those who get the goods are those who value them most. Number two, the goods are produced by the producers with the lowest cost. In other words, producers who are most efficient. If you remember, the goal of an economy is efficient use of scarce resources. So the goods should be produced by those producers with the lowest cost. Number three, raising or lowering the quantity of a good would not increase total surplus. Evaluating the market equilibrium. So a typical market is at equilibrium. The equilibrium price is $30. Equilibrium output is 15,000. So in this case, the blue triangle is the consumer surplus, the area under the demand curve and above the price. The producer surplus is the yellow triangle, which is the area below the price and above the supply curve. So total surplus is adding together consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So is the market equilibrium efficient? Well, let's look at it. Every buyer whose willingness to pay is equal to or greater than $30 will buy. You get what you want. Your willingness to pay is equal to or greater than $30. You'll get what you want. You will buy. Every buyer whose willingness to pay is less than $30 will not be in the market. The buyers who value the goods most highly are the ones who consume it. Good thing. Okay? On the selling side, every seller whose cost is less than or equal to 30 will produce the good. Cost minimization. Every seller whose cost is greater than $30 will not be in this market. The seller with the lowest cost produces the good. So let's look at $20. At output, 20,000 units of this output, the cost of producing the marginal unit is 35. The cost is 35. The value to the consumer of the marginal unit is 20. You measure the marginal unit, the marginal buyer on the demand curve. So the benefit to the buyer is 20. The cost is 35. Hence, we can increase total surplus by reducing output. In other words, resources are being wasted out here. The cost is higher than the benefit, and so 20 would not be efficient. So this is true at any output greater than 15. Anything to the right of 15 would be the wrong amount. This output, this item is being overproduced over 15. At 10, which is a point lower than 15, the cost is $10. Okay, cost as read from the supply curve is $10. The cost, no, not $10, 10 units of output, the cost is 25. The value to consumer is 40. So the benefit to consumer is higher than the cost. The consumer still values this thing better. So if you're producing 10, that is underproducing. Hence, we can increase total surplus by producing more of this item. This is true at any output less than 15. So less than 15, benefits is higher than cost. Greater than 15, benefits is less than cost, in marginal speaking. Only at 15 is where the marginal benefit, read on the demand curve, equals marginal cost, read on the supply curve. Adam Smith and the Invisible Hand. Passages from the great book Wealth of Nations, published by Adam Smith in 1776. A man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. He will be more likely to prevail if he can interest their self-love in his favor and show them that it is from their own advantage to do for him what he requires of them. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own self-interest. Every individual neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Hence, the invisible hand theory. So Adam Smith's invisible hand takes all the information about buyers and sellers into account, guides everyone in the market to the best outcome, and will lead to economic efficiency. Okay? Free market is the best way to organize economic activity because as we pursue our own self-interest, we unintentionally promote society's best interest. Asking the experts, supplying kidneys. A market that allows payment for human kidney should be established on a trial basis to help extend the lives of patients with kidney disease. Well, what do economists say? 27% are not so sure, 16% disagree, 57% agree. Maybe we'll have more kidneys when we allow people to sell their kidneys. Market efficiency and market failure. Forces of supply and demand allocate resources efficiently. Assumptions about how markets work. What are these assumptions? Markets are perfectly competitive. Number one. Number two, outcome in the market matters only to the buyers and sellers in that market. When these assumptions do not hold, market equilibrium is efficient may no longer be true. So this assumption of efficient market when there is equilibrium cannot be true if these assumptions do not hold. So, market failures. Market power is a source of market failure. Market power is a situation where there is a single buyer or a seller, a small group that control the market prices. That makes markets inefficient. We should have many, many buyers and many, many sellers, and competition. Another source of market failure is externalities. Decision of buyers and sellers affect people who are not participants in the market at all. It makes markets inefficient. Inefficient equilibrium from the standpoint of society as a whole. So, two sources of market failure: when there is market power or when there are externalities. Summary: consumer surplus, buyers' willingness to pay for a good minus the amount they actually pay. It measures the benefit buyers get from participating in the marketplace. It is the area below the demand curve and above the price. Producer surplus, the amount sellers receive for their goods minus their cost of production. Measures the benefit sellers get from participating in the market. It is the area below the price and above the supply curve. An allocation of resources that maximizes total surplus is said to be efficient. Policymakers are concerned with the efficiency as well as the equality of economic outcomes. Equilibrium of supply and demand maximizes total surplus. The invisible hand of the marketplace leads buyers and sellers to allocate resources efficiently. Markets do not allocate resources efficiently in the presence of market failure, in the presence of market power or externalities.